This is a talk about teamwork. I don't know about you, but every time I come to an AtlasCamp or a summit and I watch the keynote, I'm blown away. I work at Atlassian. I know how much we do inside my team, inside a year, but I'm always amazed to see that the whole organization moves at a fascinating pace. Every year there's a truckload of features, changes that are introduced across the organization. It's as fast, if not faster, than when I joined 3 years ago. Before joining Atlassian, I worked with probably close to 50 organizations, either directly working for them or consulting for them. And that's not at all what I was witnessing. This was actually more the norm, right? The projects I was either watching or part of were, kind of late, over budget, not meeting objectives. And it happened enough that I've realized it's really not the exception, but kind of a status quo in larger organizations. I mean, raise your hand if you've faced these 3 symptoms in any of the projects you worked on. Yeah, more than once? Yeah, over and over again? Yeah, okay, I'm not alone. Now, what I found even more fascinating, because I personally always challenge status quo, and I really struggle with living with status quo, is that a project fails, we start a new one, what do? The same thing over and over again. And the problem with that is there's a lot of complacency that comes with it. And I've heard so many times in all the orgs I work for, well, it's okay, just roll with it, that's just the way things are. And that's the worst thing you can do. It's basically accepting status quo in this case means that you allow your organization to progressively grind to a halt. And that's just not acceptable, but you know what? It's the norm, so maybe that's just the way it is. Until I realized that there's actually a new guard. There are companies that are basically taking the market and sweeping it off its feet. I'll name a couple, and I'm sure you may have heard of them. Netflix, right? They kind of completely revolutionized the market they joined. And Amazon is another one. Every time they look at a market, they completely kill it. And what's important to remember when we look at them is, they may look established now, but they started really, really, really small. They started really small, but the main attribute that they have, which differentiated them from their competition, is not that their products were the best when they started. There's one attribute that I find common to Amazon, Netflix, and Atlassian, and that's the overall pace and speed at which we do ship and introduce changes. And speed beats perfection any day. So Puppet runs, as you know, the DevOps report, and as part of that, they talk to hundreds of organizations that practice DevOps, don't practice DevOps, and came with mind-blowing stats on the differences between those 2 types of organizations. The first one is organizations who practice DevOps are 30 times faster at shipping changes. So they release 30 times more frequently. They suffer from failure 60 times less than organizations who ship, less often. But more importantly, they have a 160 times faster recovery when things go pear-shaped. And we all know things go pear-shaped all the time. Even though they ship more often, right, they recover 160 times faster than the ones who don't practice DevOps. The most interesting statistic, though, it's not the most impressive number in those slides, but to me that's the most important, is that they are twice more likely to exceed goals in profit, market share, and profitability. And that's what we all want, right? So how do you get started? How do you transform your organization to be, from wherever you are, to become an Amazon? That's like the million-dollar question. And I've struggled with this for many, many years, until I joined Atlassian. And you hear of, you should do Agile, you should do DevOps, continuous delivery, lean. And now the new term is web scale, you want every IT organization to act and behave like an Amazon. And that's all well and good, but in many cases, the people who actually end up working on these things and introducing them, I probably haven't practiced it before. So I've seen places where you get a project which is started where the business writes requirements and gives that to a dev team, and then the dev team goes, hey, we'll use Agile. And now they all do their iterations, and they work on their own doing that. And the business is like, oh, yeah, that's cute. Just tell me when it's ready. And it's basically, yes, it's doing iterations, it's doing sprints, it's doing sprint reviews, and it's doing Agile, but it's missing the essence of Agile, which is a proper collaboration between all the people that should be involved in the project day in and day out. So what I wanted to do today is to try and cover 3 areas in which I wish I knew what I know now when I tried to create my own company just before joining Atlassian, which was a fantastic failure. But if I knew what I know now, I'm pretty sure it would have been successful. And so a lot of it will be more like practical tips on what to look for, removing some of the bullshit that we hear on the terms like DevOps, Agile, and whatnot, and more covering how I've seen it practiced in a way that makes sense with probably the best team I've ever got to work with, which is the team that built and shipped HipChat Connect, which is the API that powers HipChat today, which was built originally in less than 6 weeks. So there's 3 areas I'd like to cover. The first is how you set up a team to be successful. The second is how that team executes. And the third one is how that team measures what they've executed on so that they can learn and figure out what they need to do next. And I think those are the 3 components that make a very successful team. You can point a team that knows how to execute and are obsessive over the experience and point them at any problem, and they'll be successful. So the first part is team empowerment. And there are 3 aspects to it that to me are very important. The first one is a team has to be small. This team needs to be bought into goals and needs to be on a shared mission. And they need to be connected with their dependencies, whether those dependencies are in the organization or outside of the organization. Now we say small. How small? Well, it's probably debatable, but in my experience, the ideal team size is actually 6. So you've heard from Amazon talking about 2 pizza teams. Basically, you should have a team. The team should not be bigger than what can be fed with 2 pizzas. In my experience, more than 6 starts to become troublesome. Why? Because the more people you add in a team, the more the number of links that need to be managed along members goes up. As a simple example, getting into a room and agreeing on a context to be able to make a decision. When you have 6 people in a room versus 15, you get very different conversations. You can basically come up to a decision in half an hour with 6 people. When you've got 15, it's probably going to take you days. It doesn't go up linearly with the number of people. It grows up exponentially. So my advice is when you set up teams, make them small. Now, it's not enough to just make them small. What you need to make sure is that these teams are self-sufficient. And they need to be able to operate completely independently from the rest of the organization outside of very clear dependencies. And so those teams need to be balanced. Right? So what I mean by balanced is, so when we built HipChat Connect, we realized that the important part would be the experience that both the developers and the customers would have with the end product, which is add-ons. And so we realized that it's very important to have both the technical capability to build an API, but also to design it in a way that makes sense to the 3 parties, Atlassian, vendors, and users. And we could do that in 2 ways. Like, one is we could have a design team that comes up with stuff and then throws it over the wall, and the dev team takes care of it. That's one way. The other way is to make sure that the team can be self-sufficient. So what we did instead is we looked for a team where developers could both talk with operations, so they're able to build code, and they're able to build code and ship it in a way that can be operated, which is something that DevOps advocates. And that's the part of DevOps, the multidisciplinary aspect, that we've tried to extend to the other areas. We look for developers who could also speak with designers and sit side by side with the designer to hash out a problem. You cannot design stuff on one side and hope that the developers can just implement it as is. There are so many corner cases. That means that the fundamentals of the design need to, the thing needs to evolve with the code, right? So developers need to be able to work with designers. They also need to be able to work with customer support. So basically be multidisciplinary, to me, is super important when creating a balanced team so that they're able to operate in autonomy. And the second part is to have the right cross-disciplinary people, but also have the right specialists embedded in the team. So in our case, we had a designer embedded full-time and working as part of that squad of 6. All right? So we'll go over like how the team was set up a bit later, but basically there was a number of squads, but each squad needed to be able to operate in autonomy with balanced skills. This team needs to be small, and it needs to be on a mission. The worst thing that you can do with a team when you set it up is to give it tasks. That's just like, I know that's like every other company I worked for before, that's exactly what you do. It's like, hey, we've got a problem here. Okay, that's what the solution would look like to solve this problem. All right, you go and implement that solution. That is just wrong. You don't give a team tasks. What you give them is goals. And those goals, you need to trust them to be able to execute on them. So what were the goals that were given to us when our team was set up? There were 3. The first one is HipChat needs to be a better part of the Atlassian ecosystem. And for that, we need to have a better, larger co-ownership for people who use Jira, use Confluence, use Bitbucket, to also be using HipChat. The second one is we need to drive ecosystem adoption. You guys build add-ons. People need to discover these add-ons. They need to install them. They need to be using them, and it needs to be indispensable in the team's daily work. And those two are very quantitative, right? We balanced it out with a third goal, which is more qualitative, which is user and developer satisfaction. So making sure that while we do that, we always measure and see and take a pulse and figure out where things stand, both from a user perspective and a developer perspective. It's very important to have the 3 parties here kept happy. And so those were the goals that were given to us. No one told us, you need to go and build HipChat Connect. In fact, this thing didn't exist, the idea of building this project when we started. Our goals were those, and we realized, well, if we want to increase Atlassian co-ownership, we need to make these integrations more powerful. We need to have a deeper engagement between HipChat and Jira, and then the ecosystem needs to be able to benefit from it. So while we started by building integrations with Jira, Confluence, Bitbucket, and even building our own third-party integrations to seed the ecosystem, we then refocused our effort, decided to build HipChat Connect, so to iterate on the API and the platform, and then to be able to achieve these goals. But no one told us, build that thing, right? And what we were measured on were the results coming out of those 3 things. Our leadership was helping us remove blockers to clear the path so we can actually go and do it. So the team needs to be bought into goals. That's very, very important. Don't give them tasks. Trust them to meet these goals, and always have discussions on goals, not tasks. And then they need to be able to make fast decisions. Now, we've talked before about the teams being balanced, very important aspect, so they can make these decisions together. Now, you've empowered them to make them because they're just going to be measured on those goals. But now there's a third component to it which is very important, which is what happens when there is a disagreement. And we always have disagreements. It's actually how trust is built. You start with conflict. So there's a great post from Jeff Bezos, from Amazon again, who was posted recently, who talks about something I've seen at Atlassian for the past 3 years that's always fascinating me, and it's this concept of disagree and commit. It's very often that we'll be in a discussion, and we won't agree on what needs to be done. There's option A, there's option B. We don't have time to implement both or to run an experiment or whatever. We need to commit to one. Which one is it going to be? And what we do is often make a decision in which only half of the team agrees with, but after the decision is made, everyone commits to delivering it. There is no questioning the principle of those decisions afterwards. There is no holding grudges. We basically go all in to implement it. I've been personally in cases where I had to run projects in which, when I started, I was making the case against the project. Was proven wrong, or we didn't have enough data to to really make an educated choice, we commit and we do it. A very important aspect. Why is it important? It's important because you need to go fast. And it's going to be 10 times less costly to go and making a bad decision, committing to it, implementing it, seeing that you're wrong, making another decision and correcting course, than it is to keep debating it until you reach consensus, or if you basically start doing it, but everyone's kind of half-assly, I'm kind of doing it, but I don't like it. So making fast decisions is very important. Disagree and commit is a key component to it. And lastly, the team should be able to choose their values. What's important to them, to guide and oil the communication. A lot of what we do in teams is we need to resolve conflict, and it happens, it needs to be happening very, very fast. So for that, we need to agree on a common set of principles. If you ask any Atlassian, they'll be able to tell you what sits behind each of these logos. Open company, no bullshit. Play as a team. Build with heart and balance. Be the change you seek. Don't fuck the customer. Those are company values, which help us resolve conflicts very, very often. Open company, no bullshit. Well, you don't create a Confluence page, which is private, where you discuss stuff that would impact the rest of the team. You make it open by default. It makes resolving conflicts when we are discussing potential decisions much easier because, well, everyone's got the context as soon as it happens. There is no value in keeping secrets. Those are the type of things that would help oil your collaboration. And then some teams decide to go further and define their own principles on top of that. These 4 principles come from a team which is actually working remotely, and every one of them is remote at Atlassian. And they've realized that the values we had for the company were not enough for some of the aspects that were important to them. One is active openness. So it's not enough to say you're open. You actually have to seek out others to explain what it is that you are trying to do a lot more often when you do remote work, because you don't get the same level of interaction on a day-to-day basis. And will over should is another one. It was just pissing them off when people were saying, oh yeah, we should do that. So instead they went, well, we either do it or you just hold it until we can do it, or you do it yourself type stuff. And it was very important to them, so it helped them resolve conflicts. Yes, we should do that, but guess what? If we're not going to do it, then let's just park it. Okay, so they are small, they are on a mission, they are connected, but you can imagine we build a platform and we have developers building stuff for it, on top of it, and in some cases, like they are in Atlassian and they depend on us to ship something. So how does it work when you've got, I don't know, more than 100 people and you've got teams of 6? Like that, imagine managing dependencies for something like that. It's just like, imagine your Gantt chart, right? And then you get everyone into weekly meetings to figure out, so are you good for next week or the week after? Because we've got like 35 teams depending on you type stuff. That's the crux of the problem for what people, in the industry talk about network of teams and whatnot. It's how you manage those dependencies. And at Atlassian, we've implemented a tool which you may have heard of in other talks called Project Central. I just love the principle behind it, and even better in practice. The idea is, while you may, when you first plan a project, think about it in terms of like blocks that depend on each other, and you can sort of lay it out in a kind of waterfallish type of way, but just to visualize, like this is who depends on who. You need to be able to transform that when you start executing and transferring that plan to the teams delivering it. So what we do is, we go in Jira. Whenever we have something which is more than, I think it's more than 2 weeks long, with more than 3 or 4 people or something like that, we go into Project Central, we create a project, we describe what our goals are. When we aim to ship it, kind of like we commit to try and do it by then, and the current status. And then people can go and subscribe. Hey, I care about this thing, and I care about that one. And weekly, every team at Atlassian is going in there and providing an update, which is we're still on track, or we depend on this stuff which is a bit late, so we need to readjust our plans, and we think we're going to be late by then. Which means that instead of having someone at the top sort of orchestrating everything, whenever there's a project that's getting late, everyone that depends on it gets notified, they can adjust their ticket, and then everyone that depends on those downstream projects get notified as well. Which means that there's sort of like a chain reaction in the organization, but the teams can reorganize based on what changed in the dependencies they have. And it's much, much faster than to, every time there's a delay in one thing, it's like, all right, let's all get into a room again and do some replanning. And which interim solution are you going to do? Yada, yada, yada. That's, which are things I've seen in other organizations. A bit subpar. This is much better. Project Central, if you Google it, you'll find probably talks about it from Atlassian. So that's the first section. We need to create teams that need to be autonomous, small, and connected with their dependencies inside and outside the organization. Right? You've got that, you've got the first, to me, the first key to success. The second one is those teams need to focus on execution. And it's very important that we keep in mind that everything has to be iterative. Everything has to be time-boxed, and everything has to be iterative, including building a vision and shipping. And building a vision is usually the thing where we kind of, you know, it's like an open time thing. Everywhere I've worked before, it's like, yeah, we'll take the time we need to come up with the right solution, and then, you know, the time to deliver it gets more crunch and crunch and crunch because the deadline didn't change. So instead, there's there's like three things that we do to build visions that actually the teams can buy into in a way which is extremely fast. The first thing that you've already heard about in many talks before, so I'm not going to go into it, is ship it. It's great. You can spike ideas very quickly, and you can create a pitch. That's awesome. But ship it only takes you so far. There are two things I've used in at least 4 projects at Atlassian, which are the Google Ventures Design Sprint and a follow-on spike. So what is that? Well, we often talk about Agile, and when I hear people talking about Agile, I think, yeah, it's a bit cowboyish, which is it's fine not to, like, you shouldn't do a big design up front. Yeah, that's dumb. But there's something that's even dumber, which is to have no design up front. That's completely stupid. That's actually not a quote from me, it's from Dave Thomas. So we need design up front, but we don't want to spend too much time doing it. So the Google Ventures Design Sprint provides a great framework to do that in 5 days. So they offer that you should take your whole team, not only a designer and a product manager, but designer, product manager, developers, operations people, support. Anyone that needs to be involved in shaping that solution needs to get into a room, and over 5 days, run through a sprint that starts from goals, states problems, identifies potential solutions. You build an actual physical prototype of what you want to do, which is not a real product, just a prototype that you can interact with, click on. You know, we use tools like Sketch and InVision to build stuff like that. And on the last day, you validate it with users. And the idea of time boxing is very important. It forces you to focus on the most important thing, right? So for HipChat Connect, we got into a room, and for 5 days, we identified the problems that we had based on the things that we had already built, and then we built prototypes for, hey, how would Twitter look like in HipChat if we had something better? How would Jira work better in HipChat? How would it work in mobile? Which helped us, when we time-boxed it, to come up with creative solutions to get something quickly, and at the same time identify the 4 building blocks that we would spend the rest of the project delivering. Cards, actions, dialogues, glances. I mean, the stuff you already know from the Connect API. So the design sprint is 2 things to remember. One is the whole team needs to be part of it. Not only the product manager, not only the project managers and the designers, it's the whole team, because everyone's going to be in it for the long run. And the second one is you really need to time box and just seriously go to their website, check out their process. They've got 2 to 4 minute videos for the start of each day. Just follow that and you'll be able to run one. Start with something small, and then you can progressively use it to tackle bigger initiatives as you get more versed to using that process. So that's one side, which is basically, I call it setting a North Star, right? So we define there the stuff that we aim for. We will most likely never get there. But when we iterate, we go towards that direction. And the second thing which is very important and that we use is after a design sprint, we run a spike. So a spike is about unveiling the areas of complexities where we've got the biggest unknowns. So when we did that thing for HipChat Connect with, those are the things we'd like to build, we knew that we had differences between HipChat Connect and Jira and Confluence Connect with things like, well, in HipChat, there's, every user has got a client which is open. And so what we need is to build UI, which could be pushed to every client whenever there's a change in real time, right? Because that's the nature of the tool. That's very different from Jira and Confluence. So how do we do that? And the second one is, well, whenever developers want to update their add-ons, we need to make sure that we can push those changes as well to the clients so that they can be redeployed without the developers having much to do. And so we took those two and we spiked it for a week. And it told us, well, in the end, there are things in there which are actually, we thought it was complicated, but it's small, or we thought it was easy and it's super hard. And that will help us do the thing which is, you keep hearing, which is cutting scope, where you cut scope based on validated assumptions as much as you can, right? So a spike helps you do that. You time box it, you build something, you go as far as you can. As soon as you encounter an area of complexity, you put it to the side and say, that's complicated. And you keep building and building and building until you get to the finished thing that you want, which everything that's complicated has been kind of left aside, but now you know what's going to be hard. So it's not enough to plan stuff and then tell people, now you go and implement it. When you plan stuff, you actually build code, because that's what's going to tell you whether that's feasible or not. And then, it's very easy to change solutions when you haven't committed already 6 months of work into it. Right? You identify it in the first week, that's fine, we'll just change something else. All right, so that's the first part, building a vision. These iterative aspects, of course, continue when you deliver. And that's what you've already heard in dozens of talks, right? The thing that I could not get my head around at first, and then I realized it's actually the way it should be, is that even though I hate deadlines, like, hey, we need to ship this by Summit, we've had that a few times at Atlassian, deadlines have a very strong purpose. And their purpose is not, you need to have all of this ready by then. It's, you need to have something to ship, and it needs to be ready by this date. And the principle of it is not to constrain scope, or it's just to tell you, to give you a forcing function to make decisions on what you need to cut. And so as we iterate every week, we often look at, well, based on the goals that we've got, like this whole area, we should just park it for now. So one example is, I talked about developers push an update to their add-on. We don't want everyone to go and reinstall it. Well, that's pretty crucial, right, to the whole thing, really standing together, and I was quite attached to it. But based on the complexity, we just went, well, you know what, for launch, we're just going to leave it. People will need to reinstall add-ons. It's subpar, but we know we're going to do it, but we know people can get the benefits of what we're shipping a long time before we implement that feature. So let's just get it out there. So giving a deadline is great. We presented our designs to people at Atlassian who've already worked in that domain and asked them, like, how long would you think it would take to implement something like that? And the feedback was like, oh, it's going to take a couple of years, 3 years. We said, all right. We knew there was a ship it 6 weeks later, so we just went, well, what can we ship by then? Because we'd like to have every Atlassian being able to build for HipChat. And that's what we did. We built something which was super bare bones, but it was just enough for that job. We got so much feedback from it that in the next iterations, we already had my backlog as a PM was just done for me. That's it. That's what we need to do for the next 2 years. But basically, time boxing is extremely important there. And of course, you've heard that before. Make small changes, use sprints, yada, yada. Like, I'm not going to teach you Agile there, right? But often we get too caught up in the processes and the methodologies that are defined and lose track of their intent. The intent of Agile, of Scrum, of Kanban is to help you do stuff iteratively, measure, review, resolve any conflicts. If we spend too much time in backlog and moving tasks and picking up exactly which tasks we want in the sprint, often I think that we lose track of this aspect, which is we need to be able to iterate and we need to agree on what we need to iterate on, but the format in which we do that, that should be left open. My personal preference is actually, as a PM, I know it's going to be controversial, but I don't use Jira. I use Confluence. Weekly sprints, we open a page, we write down the goals we have for the sprint, very high level. And people say, well, my goal is to do this, my goal is to do that. And we discuss these goals, but more in terms of like what the end result would be. Like, we need to have a spec ready for this. We need to have this thing spiked. We need to have this feature released. We need to move this feature from 5% of users to 10% of users. But we don't actually spend time in the Jira board, right? So we review the previous sprint goals, and we go, okay, we did this, we missed on that. We define the current sprint goals, and then the team, everyone goes back to their desks, and they each go into Jira. And then everyone goes and picks from the backlog whatever they think they need to be able to achieve these goals. Back in sprint planning the next week, we actually tick the goals, not what was in the sprint. So we don't use story pointing or anything like that in that team. What we use is that process instead, which is a variation of Scrum, which I thought would be interesting to share because we've seen that working really well with at least 3 teams. So that's the part of iteration which is about planning. So there was an iteration on vision, iteration on planning. Now we need to be iterative as well when we deliver. I'm not going to explain to you how to do continuous delivery, right? You can see that from other talks. But there's just a couple of quirks that I found make a huge difference. The first one is to, of course, use Git, use feature branches, but if you can, do the same thing for code that you do for configuration. We spent so much time losing time because we deployed, and at some point there was a script that changed the configuration file, and then we were like, shit, what changed? And so you're like, well, from the code we can tell that, but the rest was through those config scripts, one didn't go through, or whatever. Configuration needs to be part of your code. It actually travels with your code in branches, and when you deploy something, you deploy changes which are linked to the code as well as the infrastructure behind it, right? It's extremely important. But when you do that and you work with all these feature branches and you've got quite a few developers doing things at the same time and we release continuously, it's easy to lose track of what everyone is doing. And that's where I put my cap, where I pitch HipChat a little bit. That's where we use HipChat, right? So everything that we do, that everyone in the team uses, goes into a chat room. I'm not even going to tell you need to use HipChat. Just use a chat tool that you connect with your tools. The difference in speed that you can get is mind-blowing. You really need to experience it to see that. In the case of a broken build, it's very easy to understand. There's a broken build. It goes in the chat room. Why? Because broken master means that everyone in the team needs to stop what they're doing, look at what's there, agree on who's going to fix it, and then go and fix it. It's a team interruption thing. And so when you use your chat tool in the middle, it really helps you kind of oil this process. You don't end up with a build that's been broken for 3 days before someone starts looking into it. It needs to be part of the team's behavior. So we use basically integrations for stuff like that. We try as much as possible to automate as well. So for example, we use Puppet, and for that we use an integration that Puppet shipped. Again, why? That's the ChatOps principles, which is you've got a chat room, it's got a log of all the discussions. If you kick off a build, well, the chat room should know. Progress of the build, well, of the deployment, well, you can tell that in line with the conversations. So automation, if you use the chat tool in the middle, it helps you a lot to make sure everyone keeps aware of the context. It means that there's a lot more context switching happening sometimes, but the benefits of doing it in reducing time lost in communication is actually huge. And sometimes we even build custom add-ons ourselves for things that are specific to our team setup. So in our case here, we had repositories, and each one could only have one person deploying at a time. So we're like, well, it's going to be hard to coordinate. So what we'll do instead is we'll build an add-on where we can log these things. Super simple thing. It took us a couple of days to build, but now people were not clashing on each other anymore. So those are just like tips on top of everything that you can read on continuous delivery and so on and so forth, which were super useful to me. Building a vision, keep it small, make sure the whole team is involved, and you're able to iterate on it. focus on execution, give a deadline, make it really like not far away, enough that it forces you to make decisions, and then ship, and ship some more, and ship some more, and ship some more. If the incremental gains that you get will be 10 times bigger than if you try and ship every 3 months. You'll just realize in the whole team's psyche as well that the sense of urgency is maintained when you do things iteratively, where you kind of lose them in a 3-month thing. It's like, oh, it's okay, we've got time. And, oh shit, we need to do it. You don't want that. So we talked about the first 2 chapters, the right teams executing fast. Now the last one is very dear to me. It's how you measure what you've shipped and how you can make the experience better for your users. In our case, the users being developers and end users. It's not trivial. Like when I talk about experience and I ask people, so, what's a product experience to you? And the first thing that comes back is design, like design properly. And design is such a small part of what the customers live when they use your things. We actually have a methodology we've developed and we use at Atlassian, and there's a term for it, which we call ROF, which represents what an experience really looks like and how that's something which is measurable. R stands for reliability, and if you think of a pyramid, it's like the base of the pyramid. Sorry, pyramid. The base of the pyramid is reliability. If your stuff goes down, people are going to be pissed off. And they're not going to be happy, regardless of how many features you ship. The second level up is usability. Whatever you've got needs to be usable. It doesn't matter if you've got 200 features. If people don't know how to use them, or it's really complicated and you need to navigate between 50 screens, they're not going to be happy. And the smallest part is on top, and that's features. Features is probably the least important out of the first 2. But how do you build understanding in the team of like rough, what your customers actually experience, and how do you make sure that they've got the right level of empathy for those problems, that they actually go and action them? Well, to do that, there's like 3 things that we use. The first one is everyone needs to be on the front line. It's not just customer support doing support. Designers doing design. The whole team is involved with the end-to-end experience. We'll go over that. The second thing is you need to validate what you've shipped, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And the third one is you really need to plan for hiccups, because that's when you get people running around like a bunch of headless chicken with customers being left in the dark, and that's just what will make your users lose faith. So the first thing, everyone on the front line. You notice that we haven't gone through the DevOps principles or like exactly how technically you do DevOps, but there's one thing in DevOps that kind of comes across in this talk. You build it, you ship it, you run it. Well, I would add many more lines to it. You are responsible for the experience, right? Developers need to be versed in the operation aspects, but also in design and so on and so forth. Well, for customer feedback is not a product manager's role. It's not a customer support's role. It's the role of all the team. There's a great blog that was posted by Intercom, I think it was about 3 years back. And they explain that there's 2 ways you can approach talking to your customers. One is the product manager every month schedules interviews, they last for 1 hour, it's very formal, and you get feedback from it. The second is, what if you could just add something in your website or in your app that your developers could use to engage with users that have recently used something, to ask them, hey, how did you go? Is there anything we could do better? Micro interactions. There's 2 things that are great with that. One is it forces a constant communication. It's not only every month, it's happening all the time. And so you get a lot more feedback. And the second is that the whole team is involved. So the whole team can build empathy with the person on the other side, right? So in our perspective, on our side, when we ship HipChat Connect, we made sure that everyone was in HipChat rooms that were dedicated to talking with developers who are building on the platform, and we were here to support them. So we were getting feedback, and we were basically actioning them, discussing at the end of the sprint, okay, so these developers had issues with this and that. How can we address it in the next sprint? And it's much, much easier as a product manager if your whole team is doing your job than if you try to convince them that this is important. They've lived it. They've built empathy with the problem. And so one thing that we do, and I encourage you to do the same, is to receive as many pieces of information as you can, process to educate your decisions on understanding this experience. So in our HipChat rooms, we receive tickets that were created from support. We receive NPS feedback. We receive tweets when people talk about HipChat and the API. We receive information about our monitoring tools that tell us if there's any glitch right now, for example, in our app decks or anything like that. And we use that, and we, in most cases, don't even talk about it. It's just constantly present, and we glance over it, and we get a constant feel for what's coming through, which helps us when comes decision time to go, well, I've seen this thing happening 50 times before. I think now it's just too much. We really need to address it. So take in as much information as you can. Your decisions will only be as strong as the amount of information, or the quality and the amount of information that you've been able to process. All right? Something that when you join Atlassian, everyone tells you you'll be drinking from the fire hose. Oh boy, I suffered for the first 3 months, but now I'm like, yeah, that's actually the best way to work. Okay, so everyone on the front line. Second step, make sure you validate everything that you do. And validate is both qualitative and quantitative. So we've all heard of A/B testing. So you deploy an experiment before you ship a feature, and you test like option A versus option B. Which one is the best one? And instead of trying to second guess it, you let your users pretty much tell you, like, I was expecting that when I had this button here, people would click on it. If I put a button there, then, but actually it's the option B that worked better, even though we thought option A would. Anyway, that's A/B testing. It's been used a lot to increase signups and things like that. There's a company that built a framework to help you do that with whole features. So it's not only used by marketers, but it's used by software developers. They're called LaunchDarkly. And we use them extensively. What they help us do is roll out full features to only a subset of our users. So what we did for HipChat Connect is when we had the first version that we felt was GA ready, was enough for a 1.0, we rolled it out to 5% of users. And only 5% of users were able to install these new add-ons. And then we just sat on it for a bit and gathered feedback. We had a lot of prompts in the UI asking, hey, do you want to give us feedback? And we were processing that as they were coming, and often people were complaining about the same things. Hey, those cards you send in HipChat, well, they're too bulky, they take too much space. Well, okay, 100 people asked for that, must be important, let's fix that. 5%, all right, we fixed that. Next sprint, we roll it up to 10. And then we see, do we still get the same feedback, or is it different types of feedback? Basically, it took us, I think, about 3 months between the moment where we started rolling it out and the moment where every user had it. But in the meantime, we've been able to fix a lot of issues, which, if we had just released it, we would have been swamped with requests and just drowning. So LaunchDarkly, great tool, definitely check it out. So that's make sure you release small and iteratively, but you also need to measure the impacts, and that's the part where everyone talks about it, no one really does it. You need to find places where you can cut. So whenever you ship something, whenever you added a feature, you've introduced also a whole bunch of legacy. And if possible, you only want to keep the ones which are important. So for that, we keep a dashboard that shows us who's using what, and it helps us identify problems, but it also helps us identify areas where we can cut because there's no activity, right? So quantitative. And on the qualitative aspects, if you can, we use that. We use NPS, Net Promoter Score, which are surveys that go out to users. Can you please rate? Would you recommend this tool to your friends, and so on and so forth? So having a pool of qualitative data often helps you inform your decisions better. Personally, I hate to make decisions only with data. I like to do it with human feedback. And it's good to be able to do it at scale. NPS is a great way to do that. There are a few frameworks out there that help you embed questionnaires inside your app. And make this information available to all your team, both the quantitative and the quantitative aspects. And the last part, which I'll probably go over quickly, but which is none less important, is to plan for hiccups. That's part of that reliability component. When your application goes down, typically it's a shitstorm. Like any team that's well-oiled and organized and fully autonomous, their stuff goes down, the whole company is like, hey, what are you doing? You need to fix that. Give me an update. Customers go, hey, it's not working. And you're like, I know. And it's really horrible because you end up just chasing your tail the whole time. And it's very important to go to a talk that talks about incident management. We have a few. We had a few at Summit. You can find them online that tell you how to do proper incident resolution and then learn from it. My main team's audit is make sure, again, to share with the team, like everyone gets on call. It's a rotation. It's not an operations person doing that, and then that person's life is miserable. It's everyone's life a little bit miserable, but then we all learn from it and we can make the thing better. Otherwise, you just leave it with ops and it never gets better. Second piece of advice there is make sure you swarm. You have very clear processes to, when shit hits the fan, to all get together and resolve it and stop whatever it is that you're doing to get the right help, including from the rest of the organization. And the last one is make sure you've got a very well-oiled communication process. Whenever something goes wrong, notify your stakeholders, notify your customers, notify the rest of the org. For that, we use status page, both internally and externally, and it's helped us deflect a large number of tickets or just conversations that shouldn't be happening to leave the team space to work and resolve the problem. So that concludes the third chapter of obsessing over the experience, making a team effort, right? Make sure that you validate both qualitatively and quantitatively, and plan for hiccups. And if you have to start with something, I start with the third one. So that's it for the talk. We went over how you create teams, how they can focus on execution, how they can control and like improve the experience. If you start to work like this iteratively, you realize that very quickly you can outlearn your competition because your speed will be ever accelerating. There's a great resource to get started to see where you stand today, which is the Atlassian Team Playbook. Google it, Team Playbook. We use plays from the Team Playbook very regularly in my teams to see where we stand. Do we have clear ownership? Does everyone know what we are doing? That are the roles clearly defined, and so on and so forth. So please check it out. And if you have any questions, I can address them now.